So it says we're on live. Welcome to the Diagnostics Working Group meeting for April 2017, even though it's May, we're a couple weeks late. I guess we can just jump straight into today's agenda. We have, so these are the things tagged Diag agenda. Build require without debugger explicitly. Uniform way to trigger the debugger on the first line. That's about inspect break and debug break. JavaScript bindings for inspector and missing async call specs and set timeout. We've got the diagnostics discussion minutes from the collaboration summit. I guess we should decide what we want to talk about with that. The requested comments on diagnostic how-to project. I think that there's probably not much to talk about there. It's just an awareness one. And then trace events and async hooks. I know that we have the, we should probably make sure that we're all on the same page with the debugger business with triggering the break on the first line. And async hooks I know is a big topic since it just landed and Andreas is here with us. The diagnostics thing. What do we want to start with? Considering we might get.
Was there more discussion on the debug break? Like I know the discussion the CTC brought up whether or not, like I'm forgetting now, but Fishrock brought up whether it was needed at all and or what the use case was for some of the suggested backports, right?
So I can summarize real quick if that helps. From the CTC, so I'll put that as the first item. Get that out of the way. So CTC yesterday, the proposal was inspect with debug break would still mean the same thing as inspect break. Yeah, Fishrock, Jeremiah is just concerned, like, why do we have to do this? It's December major milestone we're at. We should only have to do, we should be able to do whatever we want. But there is a need apparently for some of the IDEs that released and didn't realize we would have inspect break, so they are still using inspect to debug break. So we need to accommodate them, so we're going to put that back in for a little while longer. There's an issue now, I think RefAC might have opened it that does that. I think it's moving along pretty well. I guess unless anybody disagrees with that kind of conclusion, then we don't have to spend too much time on it here.
I think it's moving along. I don't know about well, but it's slowly grinding along. It's kind of bogged down in questions of whether mixtures of command lines should have deprecations, whether some mixtures of the command line options should be disallowed. Like it's basically creeping featureism, but it'll get there. RefAC is energetic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems to be on its way.
All right. So let's. What's this next one? Build require without debugger explicitly. Has somebody looked at that? Can somebody tell us what that question is?
Sorry, I'm a little lost. Are we going through the agenda top through bottom, or?
Yeah, at this point, I just switched to go from top to bottom unless someone else has a suggestion on the next one to tackle.
Right, the next one is uniform way to trigger debugger on first line, though. That's maybe not. Am I confused?
We just talked about that first, so I put it first. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
So yeah, so I went back to the top one. Build require without debugger explicitly. What input is needed from us there? You want to know?
Yeah, actually, I remember this one. So as I understand it, when you build without OpenSSL, you disable various features. So the obvious ones are TLS and crypto, but I think other things disappear. And in particular, the inspector disappears. So Refac has a particular way of looking at it where he says, well, in Node 7, if you built without OpenSSL, you had a debugger. Doesn't really matter which one, but there was a debugger there. And in V8, sorry, not V8, in version 8.x, if you build without OpenSSL, there's no debugger at all, which somehow is going to be super confusing to people. And therefore, he wants everybody to always provide an extra CLI option to the .configure. I'm not really for this idea. Perhaps I'm not representing it as well, as a real positive thing. But as far as I can tell, forcing somebody to type in a second CLI option always when they type in without OpenSSL just seems annoying. He seems to feel that some people will be really confused by it, but I'm not following.
But it generally seems like a pretty fringy thing to do, right? So, I mean, building Node without crypto is kind of, you have to know exactly what you are trying to do if you do that.
Why do we need without debugger and without inspector? Am I just missing something there?
So I have my biases here as well. I also think this is quite cringy and maybe not that useful, but I don't know if it's going to be fair because to discuss it here because Refac isn't here. And I think he's the strongest proponent of it. So does it make sense to take it back to the issue tracker?
Yeah, it seems reasonable.
I think so.
Who was it who tagged it as something to be discussed here?
Refac.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Okay, so with that, so the next steps on that one are continue in GitHub. That down. Steps, continue. Okay. And we already covered uniform way to trigger on the first line. So going in order, I guess then the next one is inspector, JavaScript binding to an inspector. I'm not sure who tagged it, Eugene. I'm sure you can speak to this. What exactly are we? Do we have a question here? Is this a question of whether this should be included?
So there is a working implementation, and there are some clients that are interested in it, and so I'm just not sure how to proceed with that pull request and so on. So I believe all the comments are addressed on the technical side of the pull request. So what is the next step?
Yeah, I think this needs a review. Right now, it's lacking a review, so if people can review this, that would be awesome.
No, so it was reviewed, like technical side was reviewed, and I addressed some comments there. So I believe it's in a good place implementation-wise.
If somebody sign off on it, right? That's the only missing thing.
Is this 12263?
That's right.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm still looking at it. I have some open questions as to how we're exposing the inspector and for what use cases.
I think this would be a good time to discuss this.
That was a bit garbled. I didn't hear.
I was just saying, I think this meeting actually, this would be a good time to discuss whether we think those bindings should be in Node or not. I think if you have questions, could you tell us what they are?
Okay, so the first great question is there's a there's a debug end and a couple other underscore debug functions, but they're underscore functions and they're not documented. I assume because they exist that they are used by some people, so I think our API should be documented. Maybe we don't want to commit to that API, so maybe we should have a different API. But I wasn't clear on the division between the APIs that you get when you require the inspector module, the built-in core module that Eugenio is making, and the ones that are hanging off process._debug end. So I'm looking at that. I'd also really like to see a debugs begin to start debugging. So I guess it looks to me like there's two kinds of APIs here. Like one is to kind of control the inspector itself, the inspector protocol listening on the TCP port, like to turn it on and off. And then other ones are to interact directly with the inspect commands to get things like heap dumps and stuff. So that's what I'm looking at. Eugene? Or?
So debug end is a legacy API. So I don't know when it was introduced. It was introduced a long time ago, apparently, and it was working with an old debugger. So I just saw that issue, and I just went in and fixed it, simply because somebody hit it. So debug begin, there is no such API, but there is debug process. So you can call debug process on yourself. That's what my test case does. And it will start the server again.
What's the API called? Debug.process?
Process._debug process, and you need to give process ID.
Oh, your own process ID.
Yeah.
Say process update.
Doesn't that use signals? Does that work on Windows?
Yeah. So it doesn't use signals on Windows, but it should work on Windows. That's what test is doing.
Okay, so that's a good idea. There's some downsides to that, or not downsides. There's some unsupported features. You can't control the port that you're listening on, and you can't even know the port that's being listened on, or the UID. So
we can expose it through inspector-specific APIs.
Okay.
So my fix for debug end does not introduce any API. So it's really just fixing bugs in inspector around starting and stopping. So it's not touching any APIs. And for port and so on, so we can work on it on inspector-specific APIs in that inspector module. So like, I'm all for it.
Okay. So I'm okay with that. I don't have any, like, I'm not, my goal isn't to like block your PR to make sure it doesn't get to the master or anything. Just to kind of understand the direction things are moving and whether, you know, what's happening. So what you just said makes sense. Basically, all you're doing is providing compatibility to the existing undocumented underscored APIs of unknown provenance and purpose. But then we can move forward.
Should there be some discussion, or like, is it guarded by a flag, or should there be a warning? I know there's been a bunch of discussion on other cases, and I just noticed that it's flagged as experimental in the doc.
So,
I mean, as long as it doesn't conflict with an NPM module, it shouldn't be a problem, right?
I think the discussion was around making sure that people know they're using experimental features and or modules that use experimental features, right?
Yeah. Are we talking about 12.263 here, or did you move like there's two slightly related PRs? 12.2.
Oh, sorry, maybe I. Yeah.
So 12.263, the one that Eugene and I was talking about, where there's he implements _begin end and a couple other underscore debugs. Since those were existing APIs, they're not.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I must have the wrong one.
No, wait. 12.263 is the JavaScript binding, Sam.
I'm confused. Yeah. Sorry. What's the other one? Okay. Anyhow, yeah. So for the JavaScript bindings, are they experimental?
I'm looking at the PR and the doc says stability 1 experimental.
Right.
Yeah, so these are replacement for run in debug context. And it basically exposes a way in-process mechanism to get at all of the inspector API. So run in debug context was experimental, but it didn't use to give a warning. So any modules that use run in debug context today, they'll start getting a warning going forward. That's not very nice. And it's experimental from the, so I don't know, is there a agreed upon policy on having to give a warning on all experimental APIs?
Would it be better, like, could we just, I mean, you have to do require inspector to get at this stuff. Could we just print a message when you do require inspector, or that Ali, you don't want to do that either?
I don't think we do that in general, right?
Well, there was in our documentation, it does actually say experimental features are guarded by a flag. There's an ongoing discussion in terms of, there's not consensus that we should always have a flag. One of the alternatives that is being discussed is emitting a warning. So I can't say there's a precedence for saying you always have to do something, but there is an ongoing.
Context doesn't give a warning today, right? So
I don't think it's I don't think it's helpful to point out the sins of the past. Like, there's lots of old experimental APIs that we regret and we can't change. And in fact, a bunch of them just got renamed from experimental to stable because, like cluster, because it was very obvious that despite we called it experimental, it was impossible to change because people were using it and their code was depending on it. And with the inspector, it's not entirely true that you have to require an inspector to use it. The other way to use it is to install an NPM module that uses it internally, and you have no idea. All you know is this module does something great, and then you update across the minor, the inspect APIs change, which they can because they're experimental, and that module breaks, and you're like, what happened? What did Node do wrong here? So that's my concern with experimental APIs. It's not the direct users of them, it's the indirect users of them. And if we're calling it experimental, I assume that we're calling it experimental to give ourselves the freedom to change it. So we lose that freedom a bit if we allow people to indirectly depend on it without even knowing that they are. I can't see you anymore, Ali, but do you see?
Sure. I think a warning would be okay too. But I just, as somebody who uses run in debug context today, my users will start getting a warning now, and don't feel like that too much, but it's not good.
No, they're not getting warnings yet, Ali. They won't get till 9.0, so we decided not to do the warning at 8.0. But I hear that, yeah, it's the same thing. If somebody does require inspector, even if it's down deep in a dependency chain, they're going to see the experimental warning, it's going to make people nervous.
Yeah, I don't think it's a big deal.
Sam, you weren't saying that we should hide the entire feature behind a flag, right?
That's the other option, right? Like, the other option is you can say you actually have to know you're requesting it, or it would give you an error or something like that, right? Like for an API, that's exactly what's done. It's experimental. Yeah. Unless you turn it on, you try and load a module. It says, sorry. Then if you put the command line option, then you don't get any warnings. You don't have to do anything. But you specifically said, yeah, I know I'm using this experimental feature.
Oh, so you can. So by default, it throws a warning, that's the flag. It doesn't even throw a warning.
That's not actually true. For an API, it actually does still give you the warning. But I think if we had a command line flag, you could then potentially omit the warning, right?
I'm not sure about that because we had this problem with the Harmony flags in 0.12 or 0.11, 0.12 era, where a lot of code ended up depending on those, and people didn't necessarily know about that.
Right, because there was no warning.
Because
right?
you'd also have stuff like scripts that invoke the binary themselves that then also pass the flag. Like
right.
It got to that kind of level. So
yeah, I mean, I mean, the safest is a command line flag and a warning, right? Because then you really, hopefully, there's still a way you could probably not know, but that seems to be you have to pass several bars for it to be used.
Yeah, so the command line flag wouldn't work in this case because run in debug context is going away, right? So users who didn't need to provide a command line flag before, now they have to in order to get equivalent functionality.
Yeah, this isn't the same as an experimental feature that way.
It should definitely be. Are we all in agreement that it should definitely be available without any sort of flag? Right? Does everyone agree on that?
That's because it's replacing some existing thing that people didn't use to. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I have mixed feelings. I mean, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. First of all, I would ask, why are we calling it experimental?
I think because we want ability to change it in the future. So if third-party modules use this API, they can. We're setting up an expectation that they should expect breakage if we need to change the API going forward.
So the history is that people,
Grab, right? So async hooks. We added that in so that it's available for people to prototype with and offer some functionality, but we need the ability to make changes going forward.
So, but for example, taking a random example, Chrome, you don't add experimental JavaScript language features in by default. People can use them and they can comment on them and make it easy, but you have to turn it on. You make real sure that people know. Now, of course, in theory, a nice web app designer could write their code and be like, oh, I'm running on Chrome. Well, I'll use this cool experimental feature. I know it might go away, but if it goes away, I'll rewrite my code. And that seems to be the same thing we're saying here. I have a little hesitation because I think that APM vendors in particular are so used to depending on internal implementation details that they expect the code to break at any moment and just know they have to fix it. And if the inspector is intended to be used for those kind of purposes, maybe it just doesn't matter. It's not like the cluster API. It's not like the URL API. It's not like an API that's going to be used very much in user land.
Yeah. So to give some background, so inspector, what this is JavaScript bindings for a sort of a long-lived API in Chrome for inspector. Right? So it's not something entirely new. It's just exposing the inspector that has lived for a very long time to JavaScript developers as well for in-process debugging and other features like that. So I don't think it's in the same category of being entirely new API that we don't know how it will evolve going forward. We're pretty sure we have a pretty good idea of what the inspector API is. We just want some flexibility as Node core to be able to say, well, maybe exposing it this way is not nice, or maybe promises or some. I don't know what features we need, what changes we would want in the future. But it just is, it's a new thing and some flexibility.
If we change it, we break users' code, and we violate our sum of our guarantee. And I don't have super strong point, but basically I'm suggesting that I think it would be useful to land it on master so people can play with it, to document it more, because right now you can't use it at all. Sorry, I mean, you can post messages of unknown meaning or definition to some black box. It's not, I mean, you know how to use it, Ali, but I don't know how anybody else would use it. So if we hit it somehow, people could actually play with it a little bit, and we could perhaps get it to stable very quickly, and then just commit to the API. Or perhaps we should just call it stable right away.
I think Eugene has that perspective that why they even experiment or like he thinks this API is pretty stable.
You're a little bit gravelly. I wonder if you could lean towards your microphone. Or...
Yeah, so I think Eugene, I don't want to speak to him, but he can chime in. But I think he has a perspective that maybe it doesn't need to be experimental at all. It can remain stable. But I think from a Node core perspective, we've added new APIs like this to a experimental process, right? So add it in and sort of without setting expectations that modules, depending on it, we won't necessarily give them several major changes on a rapid schedule, right? It's just about setting expectations.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Like I think it would be good to mark it as experimental, but I guess the one question that I still have is, should we emit a message when someone requires an inspector to say it's experimental or not? Does anybody have an opinion on that?
I mean, so somebody mentioned APM vendors, and obviously we are used to things breaking, and we know that it's usually our fault because we are doing something that we're not supposed to, but do it anyway. But if we do, we of course have a lot of tests making sure that when something breaks, we know about it. But if suddenly something emits a warning, our users will be very worried what we're doing. So then we at least can't use it at that point. But maybe we shouldn't. Maybe it's so experimental that we shouldn't use it. But if it emits a warning, we can't.
it also makes it very hard to detect if you should be using it or not, because the warning will, like, you would have to do some very hacky node version checks, because otherwise you would have to require it to see if it's the right version. And at that point, you already triggered that warning that might annoy people. So you would have to wait for that version to cycle out completely, or do hacky node version checks if you ever wanted to use it, because you might trigger the warning by accident otherwise. So I lean towards not doing the warning just because it tends to be more noise than helpful.
I can see the argument for that. I would tend towards calling it stable. I mean, what part of the API, it's not very big, there's only 3 methods. Do we expect to change, or do you think we can change? Connect, disconnect, post message?
Well, that's the thing we don't know. What if we want to change it now? We'll be stuck not changing it till some change.
Well, I mean, you can always add different APIs in some minors. Okay. Anyhow.
I guess that's a question for Eugene and maybe Ali. Do you want to mark it, and do we want to mark this stable and then not be able to change it?
With stable, I think we'll have to make sure that we have really good documentation right out of the gate. So I think it would be useful to start playing with and get some feedback from people who have actually played with it before we mark it stable. And so documenting things takes time, and getting documenting them well also takes time. So for stable, I think the bar would be a bit higher. So I actually want to start using it. I can't because it hasn't landed yet. So how about we get some real feedback and then go to stable on a rapid schedule rather than going with stable on day one?
Yeah, I think that the rapid schedule is key here. As long as it's only experimental for a short while and not hanging around for a long time, so people start depending on it, then I think actually we're pretty safe.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. If it's experimental and intended to go stable pretty fast, then maybe we don't need to give a warning.
Okay, I'm okay with that. I'm going to watch these things with curiosity. Like I said, the history of Node with so-called experimental APIs is that they did not. We never changed them. We could not change them, and they turned into stable APIs exactly as introduced. But this is a different case, so maybe it'll be different now with this kind of API.
I think it kind of depends on what we're talking about, because we've changed async wrap when it was async wrap in branch. I think it was in a minor or a patch. So I think it kind of depends on what part of the API we're talking about.
I think you might have picked the only counter example, though.
Maybe it could be possible.
Yeah,
I could summarize a proposal if we want, and we can see if we have objections. We said we will land it. Well, we need some. Do we need more reviews? Let's talk about that. But assuming that we have the reviews, we should land as experimental now, meaning the docs will be marked as experimental. Since our goal is to transition to stable pretty quickly, we're not going to print a warning. Any objections?
Sounds good to me.
I just want to double check. So I remember having seen something very recently that suggested that we might want to do like unconditionally warn for all experimental APIs. And I don't know if that was on the CTC repo or Node repo main. I'm not sure where that discussion was, but we should follow up there.
Yeah, yeah, Sam opened that, I think.
Yeah, so I opened one discussion and James did another. And frankly, I seem to be the only person who feels that way. So just like now, I'm going to give up on that. We'll see.
I think it's trending towards the wording will be, it may be guarded by a flag. There may be a warning, but, it's going to be a case by case to say what is the right thing to do, right? Like in this case, if it doesn't make sense to do those other things and it causes more pain than benefit, then, there's no point doing that, right?
Maybe. I'm not sure if you're necessarily the only person that thinks that way, Sam, because I certainly prefer that everything gave warnings for experimental features too.
You should jump in on that PR because I feel very alone right now. So Anna has flat out stated that this particular, sorry, not the inspector, but the hooks, for example, should not have a warning or be guarded by a flag because of their nature. They're similar to the inspector. They're relied upon by people who are willing to adapt to rapid change. And everybody here who says they want to use the inspector API is like, seems to be in the same boat. Like, sure, we'll deal with changes. We just don't want warnings. So.
Okay. Should we move to the next one now? And by the way, maybe Sam, you can print paste in the URL for that issue. And this makes it okay. Thanks. All right. So the next one on the list is missing async callbacks on set timeout.
That's me.
Okay.
Right. So there was just an issue opened about this. So in the Chrome Web Inspector, if you inspect a website, you can click on a button and then you get asynchronous stack traces for your errors, I believe. And this was a feature request for adding that to Node as well. And I don't think there's like any arguing against it. I just put it on the agenda so as to make both the inspector team and the async hook team be aware of this, because it requires some coordination between both async hook and the inspector API.
So the async callbacks don't work on Chrome DevTools now? Either?
Sorry?
So Rob Lawrence, I happen to know he's a Microsoft guy. But I'm just double checking. So in Chrome DevTools, the async callbacks don't work with Node either at this point?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it can't work because the hooks are not in no call.
I see.
Right. And to add those hooks, we need both, we need async hooks to be in no core, and then we need to add some glue between V8 inspector APIs and async hook APIs.
So it's basically the opposite direction from the promise stuff, where I think for promise async stacks, I'm expecting would already work in DevTools, but async hooks don't work, and now it's the exact opposite direction. Could that be actually okay? So one of the things that is coming up for async hooks is that the signals about promises and promise context are about to be added to async wrap, async hooks, whatever. So I'm assuming that those bindings are already inside of V8, that the async call stack and promises, native promises, are already integrated. That's my assumption, at least.
That might be. I would guess not, but
okay.
At least for every other asynchronous thing, that's not part of the Chrome inspector.
So I did do some research on this issue. So this requires us to have like IDs for like every timer. And that was something that we just didn't do. We didn't do like any sort of tracking internally of that sort of thing. So I thought it would be easier perhaps to reuse async IDs when async hooks lands. The other thing is this is going to require a bunch of jumps in and out of C++. So really it'd be a lot more convenient if there was a V8 inspector, I forget what this is called, async tasks or whatever API. That could be called from JavaScript because it'd probably be a lot more efficient. I mean, now that async hooks is in master, I think implementing this, should be not that big of a deal, other than the C++ thing.
Yeah, so if it's for debugging, I think it's okay if it's not that efficient.
The idea was to only enable those hooks when -- inspector was on the command line.
Makes sense. I don't remember the details, so.
So do we have some actions to take here, or this is mainly an awareness?
From my point of view, it was just awareness, sort of to get inspector and async hook team together.
Okay, so shall we move to the next? And this is Node.js Collaboration Summit Diagnostics Discussion Minutes. Thomas, do you want to?
Yeah. So there was really no agenda. That we just talked about whatever was on our mind at the time. So it was, of course, heavily colored by what me and Daniel was thinking about, because I think we were some of the few people there. So basically, we talked a lot about. So one of the things we talked about was how do we make it easier for people for users of Node to make modules that are easier to instrument, and how do they, for example, fire async hook events and stuff like that, and how do they maybe expose certain methods that needs to be instrumented by APM vendors and stuff like that. And we talked about making a guide on the Node.js website. And then we talked about if there was a way for modules to emit events for APM vendors to pick up. So instead of an APM vendor need to know about a specific database and know about the module to then go in and instrument that module, then the module itself would just say, hey, I want to expose myself to an APM vendor. I'll just use this API or emit these events in this manner, and then I know that I'll be picked up by all the APM vendors that support this. And we didn't reach much of any conclusion, except that more research is needed, I guess, is probably the conclusion we came to. Sam, I know you also took a lot of notes. I don't know if I missed anything or if you want to add something.
No, I think you got it. I posted my notes in the issue, so you see.
I saw something in those notes about being able to inspect, let's say, the file paths when opening a file, for instance.
Yes. Should I comment on that?
Yes. Right. Start off with commenting about that.
So basically, we were talking about whether or not async hooks could just give us everything. So when async hook lands, can APM vendors just use that, and then we don't have to monkey patch anything anymore? And the conclusion was there was still a lot of information we probably would need that async hooks don't give us. So for example, if you open a file, if you want to instrument that, one thing we probably want is the path to the file. So we know which file is opened. But async hooks, as far as we could see, doesn't give us this. It gives us some wrap that I can't remember. It's called a record or something like that. That doesn't have the information on it. Is that correct?
Right. So there is a resource object that you get on the init hook, and that is the node internal handle object, where you can access some properties. I believe, for instance, you can access the file path. like
I
a
don't-
real kernel API, and even like there's some properties if you access those in the init hook, you'll get like a segmentation fault. So some pretty nasty stuff.
Yeah, I might have missed something. Very well did, because this was the first time I played with the file wrap, but I couldn't see any reference to any. I tried to look in the code to see if I could see any reference to the file path, but couldn't see anything. But I might have very well have missed it.
Yeah, often you cannot expect the properties on the object itself. You just get this is a fs wrap object.
So you specifically think that the path is there? So that would surprise me, because the C+ node itself never needs the path ever again. So there's no reason for in node that we would have added that property to the C++ object, given that nobody would ever access the property or use it. So it didn't surprise me at all when we didn't find it, because I couldn't think of a reason why it would be there. But maybe you can provide some sample code, or...
So I actually have a question. Even if we could get this file path, I still kind of hear the argument that there's going to be information that a module author might want to provide that may not be related to an async call or anything like that. So it seems like async hooks, it solves the async context thing, but it's not necessarily for all logging.
Yeah, which is, I mean, I guess, I mean, you just posted, Josh, the like your suggestion for some sort of like bus to control information there. So other examples are with like SQL, for example. I'm sure Thomas does the same thing. We want the SQL statement that's being executed for MySQL, and you know, so it's stuff like that. And the unfortunate thing is that if once you've patched the external API layer, you already get continuation tracking as a side effect, which is why I've been a little bit slow to look at the async hooks. I feel a bit bad about it sometimes, but the reality is that since we have to patch the external surface, the hooks it just solves one little bit of the problem for us. But we're gonna start looking at it soon. Hopefully it'll be more performant and it will offer some advantages.
I think our discussion was also more, so I think async hook is a possible solution to one problem, right? But after all, the whole discussion is also more about really baselining what can be done right now when monitoring node.js. Also, because at least from our vendor side, it's always difficult to explain why Node.js is not Java and why things are different there. To really make it clear, okay, that's the current state of affairs with Node.js. And that's one thing. And the other thing I would say would be to also define a standard with the tools that are there now, like, for instance, async hooks or whatever, for module vendors also, to make it easier for APM vendors to monitor them. And for that, we came up with the idea to maybe provide some API through core that makes it easier for vendors more or less to register hooks at core or at the API that APM vendors can consume. And if in the end there is then tracing events or async hooks in place or so, that's more or less, I would say, an implementation detail, and really depends on where async hooks are now and if they can utilize. But there are other problems as well, or other things to solve as well. And I think there, the way MongoDB, for instance, does it already in a way, is kind of a good blueprint of what could be done. Am I right?
Yes, that was discussed. I agree.
We could allow like third-party embedders of async hook to provide their own resource object, which would contain like the SQL query.
Yeah, something like that would be fine.
Like you can already emit your own resource object in it, can't you?
I don't think it's async hook API.
But even if you could, isn't that, I mean, async hooks is about tracking async context. Should we start capturing other log information there, or should we let it focus on just
If it's just about context, then we should remove the resource object from the API, right? Because then there's no use for it.
Okay.
I mean, is there anything, I'd be very interested in very specific things that could be done with the resource object, because like Thomas said, we both looked at it and we couldn't find what it was for. It felt almost like a node has it. The price of giving it to you is 0 almost, so why not provide it? Which I'm okay with, but I just wasn't sure what to do with it.
I think the core of the discussion was not specifically how to solve the problem, but that we should look at it, figure that out, and then document some guidance for the module developers, right? So if async hooks can do it, that's great. If we have to do something else, that's great. But I think the core thing was everybody seemed to agree that like coming up with, even if it's just purely documentation that says, here's how you use these APIs to do what will make the APM vendors' lives easy, that would have some value to get together and collaborate on.
I agree.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think we need to solve this at this meeting,
Right.
obviously, but
Exactly.
So I think it's a good, for me at least, it's a good time to just stop the discussion about this here.
Yeah, it's good to have a future point at which we discuss this, because this is pretty important discussion, and it'd be good to have a next step on this.
Also, just to mention, so this problem of attaching metadata to asynchronous events also comes up with promises. So I've been working on the promise integration for async wrap, async hooks, and there are a few pieces of information that it would be very useful to surface for the kinds of tools that at least we're interested in, and I think other people are as well. Things like when a promise is created, it's often created as part of a chain, and understanding like the parent promise that spawned the creation would be very valuable, but there isn't a nice way to surface this information. Like it's not accessible through the promise object that would be surfaced as a resource, and being able to attach other metadata would be really helpful so you can build diagnostic tooling around these promise chains. So kind of thinking about, this came up, so actually, we're running a little bit out of time and I don't want to take up the rest of it, but I think there were a few, I wanted to talk at some point about some changes. So there are a few changes to the async hooks API, additions that I think could be really helpful when we integrate promises. There's just more information about promises than there are events in the kind of current structure. And so figuring out how to either shoehorn them all in or add new surface area, a good discussion to have, I think, for this group. That's kind of tangentially related to what we were talking about right now.
I actually, there's two things I want to mention. First is that with the inspector JavaScript API, like depending on how inspector goes, I mean, there are protocol notifications that we get from inspector, and potentially people could write events to the same, obviously they would be bypassing the main part of inspector, but if there was a way for module authors to write messages into that stream, that might be something to utilize. And the second thing I was going to say, and this might make the first thing more clear, is that I mentioned in the thread that we were working on something that might help with this node diagnostic channel, where we needed to patch some modules, and we just, instead of writing the output straight to like the APM endpoint, we wrote it to intermediary bus, and then we wired up subscribers to that bus to send along to the APM providers. Which is the same kind of idea, basically providing some message bus that all diagnostic messages can be written to and people could read from. So basically, why I added those two things in here is because I hear like 3 different ways that we're talking about. Async hooks could be a little, expanded a little bit and could provide all the information we need. I brought up inspector. It could be that maybe we should just center around inspector and have it send us all the notifications we need one way or the other, and then that other project. So that's 3 right there. We just rationalize.
Yeah, those seem to. Yeah, I agree. Reading through it quickly, it seems like that could be one way to consider solving this problem as well. So is the next step like a dedicated meeting on this topic, or issues in GitHub? Like, what's the next way to start working on this?
I wouldn't mind a meeting, but we can do GitHub as well.
It would be nice to have some specific issues that APM vendors want, so that we have something concrete to discuss on, and be easier to find a common API for that.
A good idea. Maybe the APM vendors should sit down and maybe come up with a list of ideas for what we would need, and then post that on an issue, so we can then have a meeting about that.
Sounds like a good idea.
And maybe open another issue. Like, it would be easy to post a couple simple examples, like the MySQL or the FS arguments.
Good idea.
Yeah. It'll probably be slow. I think the async hooks, I mean, it's taken a long time to get async hooks in Master, and it solves a really significant problem. So I think it's good. And it's going to be a little while, I guess, until the whole problem gets solved, if ever.
Yeah, I don't want to slow down async hooks based on this. I think we should move forward with async hooks as it is now, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So does somebody want to take responsibility to open an issue with the background and set up a meeting on that?
If no one jumps up, I can do it.
Okay.
That was Thomas. Was that you?
Yep.
That was Thomas, yeah.
So Thomas, you'll open an issue summarizing and schedule a meeting to discuss this specifically.
I will.
Okay, next up, so the next on the list is request comments on diagnostics how-tos project. I think that's just awareness. If people want to chime in there. And then we have trace event tracking issue and async hooks tracking issue. So this is kind of open season for discussion on those.
So I have some comments for async hooks, but I don't know if people want to discuss the other things first. No? I can just throw them out there. So one thing I also mentioned in the meeting notes, I think somewhere, was the ability to land this in version 8, or whether or not that was possible, but it seems now that it's merged, I think yesterday or something, which is really awesome. Thank you, Andreas. Then that sounds actually possible, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things missing, and I plan to go over them now. So I don't know how many has been following the async hooks progress lately, and it's been pretty fast over the last 4 days. So I'll just cover most of it. So yeah, async hook is probably gonna land in Node version 8. It sort of depends on a few things, but the major part of that is linked Node. So yeah, so I saw you asked if it was gonna land in Node version 8, and I relayed that question to the async hook issue thread or pull request that was, and I sort of got the impression, or the consensus was, that Trevor is very busy, so I probably have to pick up the lead on that if we want to get it in Node version 8. And I want to do that. So with the help of Rafael and Jeremiah, we managed to land the async hook in master. Right, but there's a couple of things missing from that pull request, and those are missing because this is a really big pull request that generated a lot of merge conflicts, I think in just the 4 days that it was open, we had like 2 merge conflicts. So one thing that's missing is promise in hooks, or promise integration, I should say. And Matthew is working on that. So I understand he has a prototype and is just finishing that up. So that shouldn't be a problem. Then there's the C++ embedder API. And this has not been implemented. We need to implement this. And I'm not so strong in APIs, but there might be a major breaking change. So it'll be good to have that in no core before version 8 is released. And nobody's assigned to this, so if somebody feels up to doing C++ and want async hooks to be in Node version 8, then definitely jump on that. And then the last thing is about the documentation. So that was also missing from the pull request, and Torsten is assigned to that, and he's opened a pull request. And so there's 2 discussions that we sort of deferred to that, delayed to that pull request, so that we could get the big one merged fast. That is about the experimental API. What kind of flags warnings do we want? So you're familiar with that discussion. And then I raised a concern that we might be repeating some of the mistakes that we made in domain. So what you need to understand here is that there's a high-level JavaScript embedder API and a low-level JavaScript embedder API. And what I'm saying is that let's just hold off the low-level JavaScript embedded API, because I think that's only something that no core needs. It's only in there for performance reasons, and there's a lot of way it can really be abused in the same way that we saw the domain enter and exit API be abused. As similarly, the high-level JavaScript embedded API, I would like that to work like make callback, like you know from C++. So I mean, both for consistency that would be nice, but also again, it avoids abusing the before and after event to sort of hack the context of async hooks. That was something we saw a long time ago in domains. Right, and if any of these things turns out to be an issue that it's really something we need, it's just like additional JavaScript API, so we can add it in a similar minor release if necessary. Right, and so that's sort of what needs to be done. Then I'd like to say that I'm writing my master thesis and also have some exams, so cannot really be as active as I've been like the last 4 days. So I'll just like keep an eye on things and answer questions, but nothing really active in terms of configurations. And any questions you can ask now?
I would like to mention something, and you might want to add this to your tracking issue. So there's 2 separate C++ issues. There's the issue of having an API that people can use to emit their own events. And there's also the issue that the make callback that is exposed to Node add-ons is not currently tracked by async hooks. That is a to-do.
Yeah, it's not tracked by async hooks, and that is what the C++ embedder API is about, emitting things to async hooks. I mean, that should be part of the JavaScript embedded API, and that has been implemented, just needs to be documented.
Right. Sorry, I got mixed up there. So yes, that is the one thing. The make callback. The other thing is not emitting events. The other thing is listening to events, like actually listening to async hooks in C++. That's like a longer term thing, though, I think.
Oh, okay, right. Well, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
But would that be a breaking thing? I guess not. But that's just an API, right?
Yeah, it'd be like its own addition.
Does async hooks actually emit something? Sorry, it's been a while since I looked at it. Or is it just that it invokes, it gives you a hook and gives you a callback and it does something in the current context? Or Does it actually emit an event?
It does not emit a JavaScript like what we know as an event emitter event.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, they are basically just events. It's just we don't use the event emitter API for performance reasons.
Yeah.
I have another question, which is at some point way back. I mean, this has been going on for years actually. There was talk about backporting async hooks to. I think originally we talked about backporting it all the way back to version 4, which I guess since it's in maintenance mode now, it's not going to happen. Could anybody talk about that? Not necessarily version 4, but just prior to 8 at some point.
Anna seems to be in the mood for backporting it all the way to version 4. Like the sort of consensus is there's no major breaking changes because the async wrap API is like we tell everybody not to use it. And I've sort of been the body blogger on all breaking changes on that and the heat from that. So yeah, probably it will be backported, but we will probably also like to observe if there's going to be any issues in node version 8.
I mean, there's no doubt that it would help APM vendors a lot if it worked all the way back to version 8, because then we only need to support one stack instead of having to both have a monkey patch version of our implementation and an async hook version of our implementation.
I think LTS would, I'm in that working group too, would be open. I don't think it'd be like a no or a yes. I think it'd be more of a how's it working out on master thing. It's, I mean, I also feel the pain, like if it's not in LTS, it doesn't exist for me. So I like things to move back, but we'd have to see it, I think, a little bit more on master.
And I suppose it also depends on how long, right? Because the lifespan of 4 is now under a year, I think. So if it's 6 months before it's ready, you know, at that point it starts to be like, is it worth it with 6 months left?
That's true, but then at least maybe it could get into 6.
Sure, 6 is a totally different case, right? So,
yeah, 4 would be Miles is much more hesitant about merging things into 4, but 6 is a more likely target.
Yeah, I think 6. Yeah, exactly.
So are we going to consider this supported now? Is that the? I mean, we've had like some form of async for a long time, but we've always said it's not supported. Are we saying that the stuff that was merged in now is supported?
Well, is it? What's the doc say in terms of its? You know, is it still experimental?
Oh, is that the question that Andreas mentioned about experimental?
Yes, I think it's experimental until we get the make callback from C++ for node add-ons in there and docs and promise support.
The stuff that's in master now, does that work with require, or is it still process binding to get the async hooks object?
You require async, not async wrap.
Is that going to, I know I asked this and maybe somebody already answered an issue, but I'm behind on keeping up with the issues. Is it going to require change in an API as well as the other, the existing NAN implementation?
So we plan to add hooks in the NAN implementation such that native add-ons will emit events or hooks on async hooks. I'm not completely sure how that's going to work out because I don't know the NAN API that well, but I believe it can be done.
Right, so I think we'll probably have to do an equivalent in the N API as well then.
Yeah, there's a callback API in NAN, and that is what I'm thinking that we can hook into. So when you wrap your callback, that's sort of the init event it's going to emit. And then when you call your callback with that wrapper, then it will make callback, and that will emit the before and after event. And eventually you will destroy that wrapper object to sort of release the callback function to the garbage collector. And that will be the destroy event.
Okay. Yeah, if that's all, I'll try and take a read on that, because we'll have to see if there's just a one-to-one mapping to the NAPI functions where we can do the same things.
I think I saw an issue in there. Somebody was talking, or sorry, I commented on an issue about NAPI actually.
Yeah, I asked about it. I just haven't had a chance to read the answer.
Okay.
It's already there.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Could you post it in the issue tracker for async hooks? Because I don't think we have NAN in there.
NAN, you mean NAPI? Okay, so
just to clarify, do you know an API or NAPI, Andreas?
I don't know the. There's the NAN API, and then there's the N API, right?
yeah, and NAPI is the newest version, which is a C-based API for add-ons, which is going to be ABI stable. And longer term, it replaces NAN effectively. And then there's a C++ wrapper, which is really just inline sugar on top of that API. So you can still write stuff in C++, but it only will use these C functions that are exported from Node.
I see. Yeah, I was only talking about the NAN API.
Right.
I'm not so familiar with the N API.
Right. I'm just figuring that if we have to do something in NAN, there's a very good chance we want to replicate an equivalent in an API.
Yeah, agree.
So you're saying I should post that in, where was that? There's an async wraps.
But do you mean the async hooks tracking issue, Andreas?
Yes, that one.
It's 29, Michael, in the diagnostic result.
Okay, sure.
Okay, well, we're way over time. Thanks everyone that stayed this late. Any other Q&A? I don't think I see anything on the YouTube channel. Sorry, now that we ran out of space. We'll have to figure something out for next time. Any other questions from the group here?
I added a link in the chat about what you can do with the resource objects. Some old slides I have.
Oh, cool. I'll paste that in the notes too. Okay. When should we meet next? In a couple. Should we just go back to? We missed 2 weeks ago, but should we meet again the last Thursday of May?
We had like originally like every second
last Thursday of
every month. Last Thursday.
Yeah.
So
that'll be 2 weeks from today.
Yeah, on the 25th.
Should we do that? Seems like there's enough to discuss.
It's fine with me. I'm gonna be in San Francisco at that time. What time is it right now in SF?
We started at 12 p.m. Pacific.
12 p.m. I probably can't make that one then, actually, because I have a meeting there.
Yeah, I guess what is this time good for everyone? Should we do it earlier? I know it's a little late for Europe.
It's actually fine for me in Europe. This is 9 p.m. in Europe. For me, that's good in Europe.
Yeah, it's okay for me.
Okay, so I'll schedule for 2 weeks from today at 12, and yeah, actions of Diag agenda that you want us to talk about.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have fun.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.